From KQED Public Radio in San Francisco, I'm Michael Krasny. Coming up on Forum, nearly 90,000 Americans are waiting for organs for transplants, with a waiting list that seems to grow longer each year. With increasing concern over donors being paid under the table and buying organs off the internet and in poor and developing countries, we take up the ethical questions of organ transplantation in the hour ahead with your calls and emails after this. From KQED Public Radio in San Francisco, I'm Michael Krasny. Good morning and welcome to this morning's Forum. In the United States, over 28,000 transplant operations were performed last year, over 6,300 with organs from living people who offered to donate to anyone in need, and over 1,200 involving organs from living people who directed the organ to go to a specific individual not related to them. About 90,000, 70,000 of which are for kidneys, are waiting for organs, which are increasingly scarce, and last year about 5,000 died while waiting. In the early 80s, the wait for kidneys was less than a year. Now it's about 5 years. Once seen as a quality-of-life operation, a kidney transplant has increasingly become a means for prolonging life, and it's presently illegal to buy and sell organs in the United States, but there is increasing concern over donors being paid under the table, despite the present system of regulation. With illegal transplants widely available abroad and sperm and eggs and blood being sold legally, there are many who argue for easier access to potential organ donors. Many related ethical questions, and in this Forum Hour we want to focus on organ transplantation. And with us by phone, Douglas Hanto, who is Lewis Thomas Professor of Surgery at Harvard Medical School and Chief of the Division of Transplantation at Beth Israel Deaconess Medical Center. We welcome you, Douglas Hanto.
Thank you very much.
Glad also to have with us this hour Arthur Matas, who is Professor of Surgery at the University of Minnesota and joins us this morning from the University of Minnesota. Welcome. Good morning.
Thank you.
And here in studio, an old friend of mine, Nancy Ascher, who's chair of the transplant surgeon, professor of Department of Surgery at University of California, San Francisco. It's my birthday today. Nice to have an old friend here in studio. Nancy, good morning.
Good morning. Happy birthday.
And we should say, by the way, thank you for that this is the 45th year of transplantation for University of California. So lots of celebrating going on and lots of education going on in conjunction with that.
That's correct.
We'll find out more about that as the hour progresses. But let me actually begin with you, Nancy, and talk first about the general problem that we have, which seems to be really fairly pervasive, with shortage of donors and shortage of organs.
The transplant field celebrated their birthday a few years ago, their 50th anniversary of the first successful kidney transplant, and the success of transplant has made more and more Americans avail themselves to the life-saving operation of a solid organ transplant. As a consequence, we have many, many, many more people who need organs than we have organs available, and we have been undone by our own success. The way that we have depended on society, altruism of people in our society to donate their organs after they die or to donate an organ while they're alive to a friend really isn't working for the thousands of people who are waiting and the actual thousands of people who die awaiting organ transplant.
Yeah, about 19 a day or so from what I read. So why not solicit them, as some suggest, via the internet, Craigslist, newspaper ads, TV talk shows, all that sort of thing. Certainly in the offing where many people are concerned to increase the number of donors.
Well, actually, that is underway. Donors are solicited via the internet, but that is not perceived as particularly fair, particularly to those who don't have access to internet or are not sophisticated enough to avail themselves to that form of solicitation. And we have depended on a national scheme to get enough organs for the people who need them.
There are a lot of ethical problems with this. I mean, since you say the system isn't working, there have been all kinds of things that have been suggested as a way to make it work. One of them is simply compensating living donors for organs, and the stance on that has been pretty strong.
Well, actually, Arthur can best articulate the stance on that because he's been a champion of a project to try to somehow reward live donors for giving organs, and Doug can give you the opposite side of that argument, I believe.
Well, we're going to hear that debate, but
Yes.
just in terms of what it could do, I mean, we'll use you as the objective source here. It could presumably increase those who would find organ donation available, or at least could find an accessible organ.
Yes, it could potentially solve the problem of the people dying on the waiting list.
And at present, let's talk about the waiting list, because there are those who are excluded because of developmental disabilities or dementia. There are exclusions on the waiting list for people who smoke or drink and take drugs. People who have psychological problems. A lot of exclusions.
Well, the general sentiment is that the individual who's getting an organ, either themselves or through the system in which they live, have to be able to take care of an organ. So, in fact, we don't discriminate against developmentally disabled individuals if they're in a situation where someone will give them the medication. I want to be clear on that with you. We do want to make sure that people are able to take care of their organs. An alcoholic who continues to drink is not an acceptable candidate for a liver transplant, for example. An alcoholic who is able to control their disease and does not drink is an acceptable candidate, of course, for a liver transplant. It's an illness. But we've got to know that the organs are going to last on some level in the people to whom we give them.
Talking to Dr. Nancy Ascher, who is chair of the Transplant Surgery Department and professor of Department of Surgery at University of California, San Francisco. What about preference for younger people, or what about preference in general on the waiting list? I mean, we heard a lot about that with Mickey Mantle and, the sort of thing that's suggested that maybe people were getting preference. And what do we know about preferential treatment?
Well, first of all, children have a separate list for liver transplant than adult patients. Children get priority for kidney transplant because the alternative, life on dialysis, is much more of a hardship for them than it is for adult patients. But I would say that the transplant community is exquisitely cognizant of your oversight and the public's concern for favoritism, and there is ongoing oversight and analysis of whether or not people are getting preferential treatment on the transplant waiting lists.
Is there also a kind of ethical battle over, children being donors, living donors?
There's great concern that anybody who donates an organ as a live donor is able to give appropriate informed consent. And there is a notion, of course, that an individual who's 16, 17, 18, 19, even 20 might not be able to fully understand what it means to give an organ and to risk their health.
And Nancy Ascher here with us in studio, chairs the Transplant Surgery Department and is professor of Department of Surgery at University of California, San Francisco. And we also have Arthur Matus with us, who once again is professor of surgery at University of Minnesota. And Dr. Ascher, Professor Ascher, referred Professor Matus to the fact that you have been actually lobbying and suggesting that the government pay for donors because essentially it would cost us less than the fixed price that the government's now paying for dialysis. Do I have that right?
I think that's correct in the sense that it would cost us less. That's not the reason I'm advocating it. I'm advocating it because of the tremendous organ shortage, as you've outlined. I think that tremendous organ shortage and the fact that there are increasing numbers of patients dying while waiting for a kidney suggests that we try and think of some radical changes of our current policy of relying on altruism or purely altruism for donation. And I think the advantage of a government system of compensation would be that we could regulate it so that the donors get excellent evaluation and care, and that all recipients on the waiting list have a chance at getting a transplant. So the real reason to do it is to try and help our patients. But I think your point is excellent. We could do this without increasing the cost of the healthcare system because transplantation is so cost-effective compared to dialysis.
Dialysis now has about a $95,000 fixed price. Is that correct?
Per year.
Yeah.
Whereas a transplant has an initial fixed price that's maybe in that range, but the annual costs afterwards are about $12,000 a year.
And this would be government regulated and government paid, or a health insurer paid?
What I proposed would work that way, correct?
Yeah. And you're proposing a pilot project that would be for how long?
I think there are a number of ways to do it, but one possibility would be to do a 3 or 5 year project with a 1 year moratorium afterwards, so we could evaluate it and go back to the old system if this project failed.
And you found, at least by polling or by what means, that there's general public support for this?
There have been a number of surveys, actually going back to 1991, where the public is in favor of trials of compensation. It's actually the medical profession that's been a little bit more resistant. Although my sense is that there's some change in the medical profession related to the fact that the waiting list is growing, and the wait time for a kidney, as you mentioned in the introduction, has changed from 1 year back in the early 80s to 5 years or longer in many parts of the country today.
Arthur Maytas is professor of surgery at the University of Minnesota. Well, I want to find out why there's perhaps some resistance in the medical profession. Douglas Hanto is Lewis Thomas Professor of Surgery at Harvard Medical School and Chief of the Division of Transplantation at the Beth Israel Deaconess Medical Center. And Dr. Hanto, first of all, given the shortage of organs that we've heard about from both Dr. Ascher and Dr. Maytas, why not go this route?
Well, I think that we're all concerned about the shortage, as Nancy and Arthur have pointed out. But in an article that Arthur wrote, he said that the main argument in favor of a regulated system is real simple. Financial incentives will increase organ donation, so few of our waitlisted candidates will die while waiting. The problem is that there's really isn't any data to suggest that in fact would occur. And in fact, there's a lot of evidence that it wouldn't actually occur. And I think that we run, some risk of a trial without more evidence. The surveys that Arthur quotes were from the early 1990s, and a survey done by Laura Siminoff recently in the last couple of years suggested actually that direct benefits are the most polarizing method to look at compensation, and is probably not the place to start. I think one of the concerns is that the experience in other areas is that if we have a regulated market, the number of altruistic donors may actually decrease. So, for example, if I can pay for a donor and I have the ability to do so, which now, of course, puts me in a favored position, why would I subject my spouse, my sibling, or the child to a risk of live donations? So we've actually seen that happen. We've seen that happen when pediatric patients in this country have been given preference for deceased donor organs. We've seen Lanny Ross has published that the number of parents donating to their children has decreased significantly. We've seen this occur in China and Israel and Iran, where they have regulated markets that led to a marked decrease in the number of altruistic donors. So, and we can go over some other reasons, but I think that the real problem is that, and I challenge Arthur, that we need to have better information and better data that this would actually be acceptable to the American public. I think a second objection is that of organized religion. The Catholic Church has come out very strongly opposed to payment for organs. Arthur has termed this not a logical argument in a paper that he wrote, but I think that this is a real concern, that in fact altruistic donation may actually decrease, and the net result will actually be a drop in organ donation, and that would obviously not be an outcome that we would want to see.
You are also, if I'm not mistaken, opposed to organ solicitation. Well, I shouldn't call it organ solicitation, but organizations, for example, like matchingdonors.com, and where there is solicitation that goes on for deceased donors.
Well, there are two issues with solicitation. One is solicitation of deceased donor organs, which really bypasses the patients that are next on the waiting list. And I think most of us would agree that that is not, an appropriate way. It bypasses the agreed-upon allocation system that UNOS oversees. The issue with live donors...
That's the United Network for Organ Sharing.
Right.
Yeah.
The issue with live donors is a little bit more complex. I think the concerns that I have with Internet solicitation, Nancy's already pointed out, and that is that It isn't necessarily available to everyone. There's good data that shows that lower socioeconomic classes of individuals do not have the same access to the Internet. The stories may not be as compelling. There are issues of fairness in solicitation, and so I don't think that that's a solution. It's a relatively small part of the process right now, but certainly it is not the way that one would want to design an allocation system for the country. It wouldn't work if everyone was soliciting organs.
Well, Professor Mates, can I get you to address the 2 points about the dropping in organ donors that was suggested by Professor Hanto if your pilot project were put into operation, or what you've been proposing or put into operation, and also the challenge from organized religion that he alluded to?
I think the pilot project answers the first concern. I mean, that's why we should do it as a trial. There's no way to get the data unless we do the trial. This has been done in a poor way in other countries, and I don't think that applies at all to what we could do in the United States. And I would argue that if the total number of transplants increased as part of the trial, it's less important as to where they come from. I think we're very naive to think that there is only altruistic or compensated donation. I think there's a great continuum between the two, and many people who donate kidneys are doing so for a variety of reasons, including secondary gain or because they feel they're getting something out of it, or just coercion of the situation. I think that it's very naive to sort of separate it into two things. The way to answer the first objection is to do the trial and see if the total number of transplants increases. If the total number of transplants decrease, then that's why we have a moratorium, so we can say this trial failed and we need to go back to a pure quote-unquote altruistic model. And I think the objections of the Catholic Church, I think every major religion is in favor of saving a life. And I think that objections from any religion can be dealt with in this context. I'm not saying it would be easy. I'm not saying there wouldn't be people who would object. But I think if you look at the fact that if we don't do something different, we're going to have an increasing number of patients dying and suffering while on dialysis and waiting for a transplant. And I think that's how the Catholic Church or any other major religion needs to be addressed in this context.
But what about what Douglas Hanto said about challenging you to have a better sense of how the American public would support what you're proposing here?
I think that we've spent 40 years in transplantation and longer trying to make differences and always postponing making a radical change by saying we need to go back and do more groundwork and we need to go back and ask the American public. There have been enough surveys. There's been a recent Harris survey and a recent Gallup survey where people say that this would tip them over the line. They may be thinking about donating because it's a good thing, and the fact that they'd receive some compensation would tip them over the line. You have to remember what we're talking about in terms of compensation. We're talking about a variety of things, and I've not said it has to be a large cash payment. I've said it could be a variety of things, including life insurance, provision of health insurance. You could give the donors access to Medicare or the VA system, and recognizing there's close to 50 million people in this country without health care. That alone could be an incentive. It could be a tax credit. It could be college tuition. It could be some combination and a small cash payment. I think to sort of look at this as a lump sum large cash payment is not necessarily the way it should be looked at.
Well, let me go back to Douglas Hanto. Why not just try this, Douglas Hanto, as a pilot project, and as Arthur Matos says, just see if it works for getting more organs?
Well, I guess I would ask Arthur whether he is advocating a national regulated market or if he's just advocating incentives, because what he just said is a little different than I think what he's written. And what he's written is really advocating a regulated market with a large cash payment. In fact, he's even published what he thinks the cash payment could be, up to about $90,000, and still result in a net financial gain for the system. And I just think it's a very dangerous pilot project to do without more data. We're a scientific society, and I don't think the Harris or Gallup poll provides us the kind of detailed information about individuals' attitudes if we were to go to a regulated market. I think there's great concern amongst the transplant community, among many of us, that this would be viewed by the public as a very negative aspect of organ donation and could lead to significant decrease. I think insurance payments, I think that those are different issues. I think what Arthur has been talking about is a regulated market, which is quite different.
No,
and
I got to interrupt because this totally misrepresents what I've talked about. And what I've written about is that the total package could be worth $95,000, and it was up to the people who put it together that developed the package. That package would include the infrastructure, the cost of payment for insurance for the person, for life insurance, and may or may not include a cash payment. And I've deliberately not stayed away from the concept of prescribing what anything had to be. I think that this needs to be very, very carefully stated. And it's the $95,000 figure is important because that's the figure that could be cost neutral to the healthcare system. If the total package was worth $95,000, when I say package, that would include the cost of the infrastructure per transplant. It would be cost neutral to the healthcare.
Well, we're going to bring our listeners into this. In fact, if you would like to weigh in on this whole discussion we're having about how to essentially get more organ donations and get more organs available, you can join us toll-free at 866-733-6786. That line is available to you whether you're listening to us on radio, internet, or Sirius satellite. Again, it's 866-733-6786, or you can send an email to forum@kqed.org. But I want to go back to Nancy Ascher here in studio. A lot of people could sign up through the DMV, and there's so many myths that probably are keeping people from signing up, aren't there?
Well, I'm not going to answer your question, Mike, but I want to talk about something a little bit different. I think that a pilot project should be done with the potential for some way rewarding cadaveric donation. And I think it's important for the listeners to recognize the distinction between getting a kidney from somebody who's already dead, and getting an organ from somebody who's alive. And the concern that Doug Hanto is articulating relates to whether or not we would be coercing people and somehow modify one's altruism by offering money. If instead we could get Arthur to agree to have this pilot project be involved with cadaveric donation, we could easily and quickly do the pilot that Doug wants and that Arthur wants to test how the public actually feels about being rewarded slightly or maybe getting funeral expenses for their loved one. And this is already for somebody who is dead.
It's a reasonable way of mediating it, but let me get back to my original question.
I'm sorry.
No, we could certainly get more people to sign up with the DMV with a good education campaign, couldn't we?
Well, that has been tried in the past.
Not successfully.
Not so successfully. And at the end of the day, the problem is in different parts of the country, many organ procurement agencies feel that they still have to ask the family. And it is up to the family at the end of the day. The individual's wishes that are shown on their license actually could legally trump what their family wants, but most organ procurement agencies follow the wishes of the family.
In most states, the family can still overrule, yeah.
Well, legally they can't, but that's how it's done.
Well, we'll return with your calls and emails. This is Forum. I'm Michael Krasny. This is Forum. I'm Michael Krasny. We're talking this hour about transplantation and about the concern about increasing the supply that some health experts and economists actually want to do by legalizing the market for human organs, and we're examining that issue as well as some of the ethical questions involved. Nancy Ascher with us here in studio, who says, and I'm quoting, virtually every single person in this country knows someone who has end-stage organ disease and who could benefit from transplantation. And by the way, University of California, San Francisco has premier programs in transplantation of virtually all solid organs, and they've named this Transplantation Week to celebrate their 45th anniversary. This whole week we'll be hosting at UCSF a number of events open to the public, and topics will include nutrition, sexuality after transplant, clinical trials, hepatitis B and C awareness and screening, supporting caregivers, fitness and transplants, HIV and transplantation, and the long-term effects of taking anti-rejection medications. That's just to name a few. By the way, Nancy, people want more information on the activities. They can just go to your website, I presume.
That's correct.
What is it?
Well, UCSF.edu, and then look for transplantation.
There you go. And again, Nancy Ascher is chair of the Transplant Surgery Department and professor of surgery at University of California, San Francisco. With us also by phone this morning from Minnesota is Arthur Maytas, who is professor of surgery at the University of Minnesota, and also Douglas Hanto, who is Lewis Thomas Professor of Surgery at Harvard Medical School and Chief of the Division of Transplantation at Beth Israel Deaconess Medical Center. Let's go to your call. Steve, you're up first. Good morning.
I'm curious about the comment made by the professor from Boston, I believe, the need to get more data. The question really is, will the offering of incentives suggested by the professor from Minnesota crowd out the altruistics by less than people who are going to donate for money? And it seems like the pilot program offered is precisely the only source of data that would answer that question. And, of course, if the answer is positive, that it will bring in less people than the crowding out, then there's a clear answer of why not to proceed. If the opposite is true, not only will you get more donations of kidneys, but furthermore, you're going to be able to wipe off a lot of people off of the list, even increasing the likelihood that people who don't have the money to pay or don't have the kind of insurance will get a donor from the standard national waiting list. And I'll take the answer off the air.
All right, and we thank you for the call. Douglas Hanto.
Well, I think the problem is that we haven't done the survey that asks the kinds of detailed questions to know whether this crowding out phenomena will occur. Gabe Danovich, Frank Delmonico, myself, and others believe that the data from the pediatric deceased donor experience, data from China, data from Israel, data from Iran, and our own personal experiences believe that there's a real risk that this phenomena would occur, and that would really be a tragedy. We're all concerned about the number of patients that are waiting and dying on the list, but if we made the problem worse, no one would feel worse than Arthur, Nancy, myself. So I just don't think that we have the data, that we don't have the data to suggest that by giving financial incentives in the way that Arthur has suggested will increase donation, but we certainly have a lot of information and experience that suggests the opposite will happen, and that's my concern.
Dr. Maytas, you want to weigh in here?
I think it's important to recognize that the situations that Doug's talking about are not crowding out in the sense that the total number of transplants went up. After all, the results of a living, unrelated donor transplant are as good in kidney transplant as a living related donor transplant. So if the study shows that the total number of donations goes up, then that's okay. The results will be exactly the same. It may be that many of our donors today feel compelled to donate and coerced or forced to donate by the very, very long wait time that we currently have for kidneys. And it may be that some of those people won't donate, and I actually would argue that that's good. That if somebody who feels coerced by the situation today doesn't donate if the total supply goes up. So I think there's lots of ways to look at the same data and argue back and forth. And it comes down to the bottom line is we'll never get an answer without doing a trial.
Well, let me go to Nancy Ascher. Hear from you on this.
Well, I think the person who called in had the answer. He said, how are we ever going to know unless we do a pilot? And I would weigh in that way. We need to do a pilot. It has to be controlled in a way that people like Doug Hanto feel comfortable with it. It has to be time limited so that we have an opportunity to review the data and actually make the decisions going forward after that. But I think we need a pilot trial.
Let's hear from more of our callers. Jane, morning.
Good morning to all of you. A very interesting show. I just have one question. Is there any state in the U.S. or any country around the world that has automatic organ harvesting unless somebody opts out?
Yes.
Nancy Ascher, yeah, where?
Yes, in Belgium, there's a presumed consent where we're talking about for cadaveric organs. It is assumed that the family and the individual wants their organs used unless they specifically have opted out. And they have a higher rate of organ donation than we do.
By the way, if you have some thoughts about whether government should compensate people for organs, or if you want to join us with questions or comments, you can do so toll-free at 866-733-6786, or simply send an email to forum@kqed.org. And David, morning, you're on.
Well, I'm in favor of this, and I would just sort of like to draw a corollary to the blood donation experience. I have donated blood in the past, and it's a painful, time-consuming effort for which I get a donut. The patient is getting something precious. The hospital is getting the funds for the surgery, and I have a painful experience in a donut, and so I just think that patients or the donors deserve more. And let me just add, I do have a pink circle on my driver's license.
Okay. Thank you for that call. Appreciate hearing from you. And again, it's striking to me, Dr. Matus, that there's not more done to simply get people to make that, get that pink slip on their driver's license. Pink slip sounds like a rejection or a firing, but that circle on their driver's license that says that they're willing to be a donor.
I think everything is being done. There's tremendous effort, or has been tremendous effort over the years to have public awareness campaigns to talk about the need for transplantation, and I think that makes my point. It's that. And I actually would encourage all of those things to continue to be done. I think everything that we can do to increase donation is good. The problem is that in spite of all of those things, and in spite of the money and effort that's been spent, we still have this problem. The reality of it is that if everybody who could be a donor donated, there would still be an organ shortage. And so that's why I think we not only need to increase deceased donation, but we also need to find a way to increase living donation as well.
Is it fair to say, Nancy Ascher, that illegal transplants and donor organs are pretty widely available abroad, particularly in underdeveloped countries?
Yes, I think that is true.
And so there are people who illegally or in some kind of black market way are availing themselves of that. To what degree, do we know?
I'm sorry, I don't know the figures. We have numerous patients who go abroad and come back, and we care for them after they've had their kidney or liver transplant in China or India.
Let me go to more of our callers, and we'll go to San Jose. Maria, good morning.
Hi, good morning. I'd actually like to hear more about organ cloning based on stem cells. I think if that became a widespread thing, that we wouldn't even have an issue.
Nancy Ascher.
I think we are some years from that kind of technology, but clearly that would help us all. We would be delighted.
Thank you, Maria. And we'll go next to Bruce. Bruce, join us. Good morning. You're on Forum.
Hi. I'm wondering, wouldn't it solve the availability problem if people who agreed, like when they go to the DMV and say, are you willing to give your organs, are given priority over those who didn't agree? Because some people are getting organs who weren't even willing to donate their own in case of their demise.
Douglas Hanto, what do you think?
Well, there are organizations that suggest this. The problem is that just agreeing to donate and then getting preference doesn't mean that you will actually donate when the time comes. So unfortunately, the two events are separated by a time problem that doesn't probably make it a realistic way to do it. But I would also just raise the issue, the caller raised the issue about donating blood, and the issue has been brought up about donating eggs.
Or sperm.
Hello?
Yeah, or sperm, I said.
Or sperm, yeah. And the problem has been in the egg business, and there was a book written by a professor at the Harvard Business School. The experience with buying and selling of eggs has been that in order to get more and more people to donate, including young women, not necessarily always understanding the risks and complications, is simply to raise the price. And so coercion is a real issue here, and the experience is likely to be the same as it has been in other situations, and that is that those most vulnerable or the disadvantaged are the ones who are most likely to avail themselves of the direct payment if that's the methodology that is ultimately used. And I think we have real concerns about that. And Arthur, I'm sure, would have concerns about it because he's been one of the advocates for protecting and maintaining a database on live donors.
Did you want to comment, Professor Matus?
I absolutely agree. Any of us, including those of us who advocate for this, are extraordinarily concerned about the care of the donor and the outcome of the donors. I think the argument in terms of how much or how it's paid is a separate argument than whether or not we should do it. And I actually agree with what Nancy said, is that if we were to establish such a system, we would have to establish it in a way that people like Doug, who are one of the group that are concerned, would buy into it in terms of establishing a system of compensation. Again, when I say compensation, it doesn't have to be direct cash. It could be health care or whatever, that everyone would see as a benefit. None of us want to consider or think about exploiting the poor or exploiting a vulnerable subset. On the other hand, I think it is acceptable to say that you could develop a package of compensation that people would make a rational decision that it is in their best interest, weighing the risks of the surgery versus the benefit of the package, that it is of benefit to them to move forward in considering donation, recognizing that at the same time they have the potential to be saving a life while doing so.
Nancy Ascher just handed me a bill that's, I guess, going before the Senate to amend the National Organ Transplant Act that would increase criminal penalty deterring any commercial purchase or sale of organs and increase the supply of donated organs by clarifying the legality.
I believe the bill actually allows for a national system and allows for the payment of some type of incentive or benefit in exchange for an organ.
Right. So it has the combination of increasing the penalty for any private commercialization, but allowing a government-sponsored system of compensation. And
what is the status of that bill? Does anybody know where it is, or is it?
Well, it's an amendment to NOTA.
In terms of the support for it.
Well, it hasn't even been put forth yet. It's going to be introduced in Congress, I believe, in the next week or two, as an amendment to NOTA.
It's still in committee then.
Correct.
Here's Michael from Berkeley who says, I hope you talk about the elegant and appropriate idea that organs should be available only to people who have registered as post-mortem organ donors and their minor children. I'm not sure why I should have any right to control my body after I'm finished using it, but people who do this certainly don't have any claim on anyone else's. Here's a listener who says there's an organ supply on death row, death by harvesting, plus those that die otherwise in prison. And another listener, Annette, writes, perhaps we're too enamored of high-tech medicine and all its manifestations. I propose we do away with all solid organ donations entirely and simply allow people to die when they're too sick to sustain life with their own organs. I'm not against giving blood for blood transfusions or accepting blood transfusions. I knew a man who had a severely diseased liver due to hepatitis C. He wasn't told that after his liver transplant he would still have hepatitis. The virus proceeded to destroy his new transplanted liver, and he ended up having a very short amount of extended life after enduring the massive trauma of the liver transplant, which took a long time to recover from. For all the expense, monetary cost, emotional trauma, physical trauma, associated with a transplant, he ended up with barely 1 extra year of even relatively decent health. Americans are too afraid of death. We're all going to die sooner or later. Let's just accept that and learn to be at peace with that instead of using high-tech heroic measures to try to prolong unsustainable lives. And what do you say, Professor Ascher, to that kind of comment?
I appreciate that sentiment, but in fact that's not the widespread sentiment of most people in the United States.
In fact, the widespread sentiment seems to be more and more toward prolonging life with transplants, as I said at the beginning of the hour. Well, Roberta, join us. Thank you for waiting.
Thank you. Say, I was wondering if this transplant database were to actually be created, is it possible, I had a question, is it possible to, at the time when someone decides to become part of it, can you obviously type their blood, would you cross-match their organs at that point so that if there was a need that it would be immediately, you'd be notified and, and the transplant would take place?
Nancy Ascher?
We do not get details on the specific antigens of anybody when they sign up when they sign their license, their pink slip on their license. We think that we need to separate out the notion of somebody being willing to donate and whatever event occurs at the end of life for that person in the case of a cadaveric organ. In the case of a altruistic or live donor, in fact, when someone expresses interest, they are typed, and then their organs can be available to the most appropriate person on the list. But I think the database that this caller is talking about already exists, and its main purpose is to make sure that we understand the outcome for live donors and to make sure that those live donors continue to be healthy over the long term.
Let me thank the caller. And by the way, just statistically, as I said at the beginning of the program, there are about 90,000 who are waiting for transplants. Roughly 70,000 are waiting for kidney transplants, 17 for liver, and the rest are pancreas, heart, lung, and intestinal. And let me go to more of your calls here. From Walnut Creek, Darlene, good morning.
Yes, thank you so much for the gift of life. My grandson had a liver transplant. He waited many years for it. He did receive it when he was about 10 or 11 years old now. And the problem with we're so grateful for it with Dr. Rosenthal and his incredible medical team, but we just felt that the support system should be more there, especially for children, because you'd go there and you'd have this, it's like a Russian roulette in a way, where you'd have to figure out where he is on the list, and sometimes he's dropped, and we realized how critical he was. And it's just something that has to be dealt with children especially, and with their support team, about what goes on, what really happens before and after the transplant, because he was trying to get back and feeling, he says, I just wish I was a normal kid. He was very positive most of the time, but it's just something that I think the hospital has to recognize, that you really have to personalize this, feel like where the family is, where the child is. And I'm getting emotional thinking about it, but he was so positive, and we thank you so much for it. But he needs support afterwards too on these anti-rejection drugs. I mean, they're totally out there, different, and even their focus is different. He's getting even problems in school. I mean, just trying to fit in. And I think it's such a delicate age. He's now 12, and it's just such a delicate age that if you could have more of a support team for the children and for their families, it would be so helpful. But thank you so much for the gift of life.
Well, thank you for that call. What, Nancy Ascher, is being done in terms of post-transplant support and all of that? There's a lot, isn't there?
There's a lot. I don't know if this family's so far away distance-wise that they can't come to our weekly support groups. Part of this week is an attempt to really educate post-transplant patients about how to maintain health. The adolescent problem is a specific one, and a particularly difficult one, she's right. In the age of 12, when you're trying to be just like everybody else, having to take medicine every day really doesn't fit. It's a problem.
And if I go back to you, Douglas Hanto, since you're against some of the compensation that's being offered as a way to at least get more organ donors, compensating, well, I think it's pretty safe to say that your position is a protection of the donor and society's dignity by saying that there shouldn't be this kind of free market or subterranean market availability of donor organs. There's some who would say, this is an individual decision, and therefore it's kind of patronizing to say that those limitations should be imposed. And I wonder what your response is to that.
Well, I think that donor autonomy is an important issue, and to a degree, we do have to understand and respect that. But the decision to donate also involves the surgeons, the recipient, the hospital. It's a process that involves a number of other people, and so it can't be purely up to the donor to, make that decision, particularly if they're coerced. I mean, we go to great lengths to make certain that family members are not being coerced and provide outs for family members who are being coerced, and I think that the risk with these kinds of direct payments or incentives is that people will be coerced and not provide free and informed consent and be truly voluntary. And it's going to be very difficult to sort that out. And I think one of the concerns that has been raised is also the risk to the recipient, in that a donor may not be forthcoming about certain health issues in the past or currently that might be difficult to sort out in the donor process. And I think that could potentially put the recipient at risk. That certainly has, and I don't necessarily mean to make the analogy between what would happen in this country and patients like all of ours who have gone abroad, but there certainly are risks when the donors are paid.
Well, you've just given a good countervailing argument for one of our listeners. James says, why is it I cannot sell my organs to someone if I want to? There are all of these ethical arguments that are often posited, but in the end, isn't it my choice? If someone were to offer me $90,000 for a kidney, I would seriously consider it. After all, I spent all the time, money, and effort to grow my kidneys into the wonderful organs they are today. So you get the sense of how those things often operate in people's minds. In the meantime, you're listening to Forum, and we've been talking to Professor Doug Hanto from Harvard and Arthur Mattis from University of Minnesota, Nancy Ascher from University of California, San Francisco, all transplant surgeons. And this is Pledge Week for KQED Public Radio, so for more information about how to support KQED, simply go to our website at kqed.org. I'm Michael Krasny. And more of your calls from Mountain View. Ann, morning.
Hi. I just wanted to make 2 points for the listeners who were saying that there should be preference for people who in advance say that they want to donate their organs. That's forgetting that often people who need organs aren't in the best health to begin with and probably aren't going to be able to volunteer up front to be organ donors on their driver's licenses. And there's also, I think, a huge issue here of trust in large segments of our population. People who have legitimate reasons not to trust our for-profit system, and how well it will evaluate and treat them if they're in a crisis that might lead to their being an organ donor. And I think we really have to address some of these really major underlying issues in our medical system overall before we can do the kind of really major outreach for organ donors that will, solve the shortage of organs.
Well, I thank you for that call. And apropos of that call, Arthur Mattis, here's a listener who writes, you should have had a market economist on your panel today. In addition to the doctors, it seems that once you legalize a system of transplantee compensation, it will spawn various auction schemes for awarding transplants to the highest bidders. I'm all for creative ways to increase the number of transplants, including financial market models. However, I think the devil, again, is in the details, and that what is being proposed is oversimplistic, could easily reduce the supply through simple short-sightedness about the influence of economics on human nature.
Well, I think there are market economists who have come forth and said, let's just have a free market and let it go at that. My problem with a free market is that it won't be fair in the sense that the rich will be able to buy the kidneys and the poor will not. And the advantage of a government-regulated system is that the government would be the group, or private insurance, if it's set up that way, would be the group that's compensating the donors, and the kidneys would be allocated to all the recipients on the list just the same way that we allocate deceased donor kidneys to all the recipients on the list. And I think both from a practical perspective, from our patients' perspective, and a public acceptance perspective, for those three reasons, I think the regulated system that I've advocated for would be much better than a free market system.
Of course, you're saying the government's regulating financial institutions now, so
right.
What is this? Here's another listener who writes, I've noted it on my driver's license that I will be an organ donor for all or any organs that are usable. However, I'm a cancer survivor, had chemo for breast cancer 15 years ago. Other than that, I lead a very healthy lifestyle. Are my organs usable? And if not, why not? Nancy?
If this person had cancer cured 15 years ago, I would say that her organs are fine.
And she says, by the way, they won't let her donate blood, but that's a different story. Let's get Jim on. Jim, thanks for waiting. Go ahead.
Hi, this is Jim Spencer, and 8 years ago, yesterday, I was giving a living donor, and Dr. Ascher was the doctor of the donor, and her husband, Dr. Roberts, was my surgeon. And I just wanted to point out, first of all, thank you. But I also wanted to point out that for a lot of people who are very altruistic, the loss of pay and travel could be a big issue. And if that could be compensated, I think the altruistic members would increase. In our case, since we both taught at a community college, we had sick days coming, and therefore there was no financial loss. But
it's an important point. Arthur Matus, how is this figured into your plan?
I think that everyone who argues for and against my plan would agree. I can't speak specifically for Doug, but I suspect he also would agree. But that financial disincentives should be removed. In fact, payment for travel and for the cost of donating is legal under the current system. Lost wages is not necessarily included in the current system. It's certainly travel and hotel bills and so on is legal. But every one of us who argues both for and against this compensation plan would agree that donors should not have financial disincentives to donation.
Well, we will certainly continue to monitor your proposal, Dr. Matus, and we want to extend thanks to you for joining us this hour. Again, Dr. Arthur Matus is professor of surgery at the University of Minnesota in the Department of Surgery there. Also, our thanks to Douglas Hanto, who joined us from Boston, and he is Lewis Thomas Professor of Surgery at Harvard Medical School and Chief of the Division of Transplantation at Beth Israel Deaconess Medical Center. And our thanks to Nancy Ascher, who is Chair of the Transplant Surgery Department at University of California, San Francisco, where she's Professor of Surgery, Transplant Surgery. And again, this week, lots of activities, ucsf.edu. Find out all about them. Transplant Week, the 45th anniversary. Congratulations on that score, Nancy. And thank you all again for being with us. You, our listeners, we're appreciative of your being with us here Monday through Friday, 9 to 11, and hours repeated 10 to 11 in the evening. Want to thank our senior editor, Dan Zoll, and our producers, Kevin Guillory and Judy Campbell. Our engineer is Danny Bringer, and our executive producer is Raul Ramirez. For all of us at KQED Public Radio, I'm Michael Krasny.
Funds for the production of Forum are provided by the members of KQED Public Radio and the Claude and Louise Rosenberg Jr. Family Foundation.